early 20th century styles. We will continue our exploration of how and why architectural styles developed in America, and we will work on our continued identification of American building styles. So following the Industrial Revolution, where we saw a lot of change, particularly in downtown cities as factories became more and more widespread, and then of course, as we started to develop factory towns throughout the countryside, we saw again a revival of classical styles, particularly Neo-Gothic, New Gothic, and Greek Revival. These come at a period when both form and order are considered necessary to reintroduce to the American public. So we again see this used on educational facilities, institutions, government buildings, but we also see it used for wealthy homes. Again, thinking about the way high-style architecture is afforded to wealthier folks. This is very true again during this other period of classical revival. Through the early 1900s, through the 20s, as we begin to explore air travel and we begin to have international air travel, we now have global influence on architecture in America. We can definitely see this. One of the great examples is the Frank Lloyd Wright Roby House, in which Frank Lloyd Wright uses lines and curves that were influenced by Japanese architecture. We can see these sort of flat, low roofs, with the roofs extending to cover these porches. We see a lot of play with interior, exterior spaces. In a lot of his houses, we talked about falling water previously. A lot of interior, exterior play, a lot of natural elements coming into the structures, and he's a master of this. And we can start to see global influence coming into a lot of architecture in America from this point on. Really from this point on, as everything becomes more and more accessible, not just with travel, but with communication, eventually with the internet, architectural style becomes less defined by geography, which is really interesting. We definitely still have architectural style that is regional or very, very local, especially in vernacular style, but high style now becomes sort of a mesh of other ideas that are from other places, which is quite interesting as we move forward. Following the Great Depression, we see sort of an ode to economic recovery with the Art Deco style, which of course flies in the face of the arts and crafts movement. We're moving away from simplicity and we're really moving back into over-the-top details and extreme expenses. No cost is spared for these types of structures. We're going very tall because we can. We're going very detailed and ornate because we can. We see these gargoyles that are evident from the bottom story all the way to the top, and they're large, they're expensive, they speak to wealth, and they speak to design. And that's what Art Deco wanted to do. Moving into one of my favorite periods, into modernism, we of course have to reject this grandiose gesture that Art Deco brought us and move into something more simplistic. If you're picking up on a pattern here, we often go from classic to elaborate to simple, to classic to elaborate to simple. And arguably the pattern stops here, but I think we could still maybe pick up the pattern in very unique ways as we move forward here. So, of course, modernism is the simple phase. We have a rejection of everything that we knew about architecture in an attempt to come up with something completely different and new. So we're not only going for simple lines, straight lines, rectangles, squares, etc., but we're trying to incorporate some of the new technology, some of the new material that we've developed over this time period. We're starting to play with concrete. We're starting to play with steel more. We're starting to play tricks on the mind with shapes as well. If you recall the columns on the arts and crafts structure, on the bungalows that were wide at the bottom and narrow on the top to express this very sort of rudimentary weighting system of these columns are holding up the awning. Modernism seeks to reject that. Maybe things are floating. Maybe things are held up by magic. Maybe you have questions, or maybe you just accept it as it is. I love this example of this modern building because we have these very simple square windows and rectangular windows, but we also have a round window. It's the only one that we can see on this plane. And it sort of stands out to me as a rejection and a playfulness of what you classically thought architecture could and would be. Of course, modernism is very complex and we have a lot of subcategories to it. One of the subcategories to it is brutalism, which embraces this sort of unwavering concrete building that might be cold not only to the touch, but also emotionally cold. It maybe invokes a feeling of governance, of structure. It's very dominating to the landscape. This type of structure, again, speaks to the technology and the material that was available at the time. It's really our first time using concrete as a pliable material. We see a lot of playfulness with concrete. We see prefabricated concrete being shipped onto the site. So it's made in a factory, made in these sort of weird geometric patterns, or made to fit together like a puzzle, and being brought onto a site which has not been done before. We see the limits of structure being pushed. We see some really heavy materials starting to move skyward with brutalism. I think there's a lot of beauty in brutalism. I think that there's a way to consider these very dominating and controversial buildings with respect to the material and respect to the technology here. We can definitely say that because of brutalism, we understand concrete as a material even better than we did before. And we can push the boundaries with a lot of materials more than we did before. An additional subcategory for modernism is formalism, which I think is really interesting in that modernism is often considered a rejection of sort of classical styles, but I think formalism is maybe embracing some of these classical styles, but with a new twist. So formalism asks that every component of the building be self-contained. We're looking back to columns, but we're not looking to make these columns elaborate. We're looking back to simple roof lines, but we're stopping there. We're not adding triangles or entablatures to the roof lines. We're keeping everything as straightforward as we possibly could. There's subtle detailing, but it's not going to be obvious. It's not going to be representative of dominance or of education. Really, the dominance and the education comes from how simple the structure appears to be. I often say that creating something very simple, like a building, is incredibly difficult. So if you're looking to create something that's very sleek, doesn't have a lot to it, it's very challenging compared to something that's very elaborate, because in something that's elaborate, there's all these ways to not only hide mistakes, but to also hide structural elements, support structures, etc. But in something very simple, like in formalism, everything needs to be subtle and everything needs to be utilitarian, or anything beautiful needs to not detract from the simplicity of the structure, which is very challenging to do. So now let's talk about some 20th century vernacular structures here. I'm sure as many urban planners are aware, throughout the 20th century we see car ownership, car culture start to emerge in America and really dominate America by the 50s. So as we see this rise in car centrism through the 20s, through the 40s, etc., we start to see a rise in vernacular structures to serve this new phenomenon. We see fuel stations, hotels, parks, park ranger offices, travel centers, all starting to emerge in response to this particular object, which is fascinating. I think often we don't think about these structures as significant, and that's sort of the point of examining vernacular architecture, is to examine things that we might just walk past or might ignore as part of our everyday life. if we examine the architecture of, say, a gas station, in this particular example, we see maybe a Mission Revival style gas station, but we also see that this gas station has an awning. And the awning really speaks to the usefulness of the gas station and what the gas station is prepared to give you. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about car central vernacular architecture because that could be a whole series in and of itself. But know that through this time period, we start to see these structures emerge, and then we also start to see these structures arguably taken for granted as they emerge and as car culture becomes so ingrained into who we are as Americans. So they sort of become present and then disappear on our landscape without actually disappearing.